John Lennon's second solo album, Imagine, not only contains one of the most iconic songs in rock history, but also captures a moment in time right at the birth of the home studio, a concept up until then that hadn't even been considered. John purchased Tittenhurst Park in 1969 for the grand sum of £150,000. In fact, the Beatles had their last ever photo session in the grounds there in August 1969. John's normal recording routine would have been to journey to London from Berkshire to Abbey Road Studios, but EMI had been slow to integrate new technology and even had rules on how certain instruments could be recorded. Those frustrations, coupled with John's desire not to make the hour-long drive to London, led him to commission Eddie Veal to build him a studio that he said he wanted to be at least as good as Apple Studios. John was anxious to have the studio completed by the end of 1970, but the wiring of the studio went well into the Imagine sessions in the spring of 1971. Veal said, "I don't think a day went by without John visiting and saying, 'Well, how's it going? Can I get in yet?' Eventually, we came to the arrangement where the engineers could work in the mornings and John could have it for the rest of the day. This quickly developed into long days for me, because John wanted me around for the sessions as well, in case anything went wrong, which it often did. The studio itself was built in the annex of the house, as it was close to the kitchen for all the usual teas and snacks and stuff, and sufficiently away from the house that it didn't impact on the domestic scene. Up until that point, home studios had been no more than a room with a Revox machine and a microphone, more of a place for musicians to trial ideas before getting into the proper studio. The Ascot project would be a first not only for Veal but also for the UK. The console at Ascot Sound Studios was custom designed by Eddie Veal and Dave Dearden, who later founded Audient. It was based around CADAC modules. According to Veal, the reason they custom built the console was that they couldn't get a console from a traditional manufacturer in the short amount of time they had to complete the design and build of the studio. Consoles were all built to order at that time, and the only serious console builder for studios was CADAC. But we didn't have time to wait for them, explains Veal. We ended up using CADAC modules, and we did all the metalwork and wiring ourselves. The console had 16 microphone input channels with 3-band equalizers. There was 8 master outs that were fed to the 3M56 1-inch 8-track recorder, which was newly purchased by John for the studio. The bulk of the Imagine sessions was between the 24th and the 28th of May. The recording was swift and performed live. The live room was spacious, but still intimate enough for eye contact and a little bit of instrument bleed, which can be heard here. Lennon had assembled a who's who of talented musicians to form the band for Imagine. On drums was the 20-year-old Alan White, Jim Keltner and Jim Gordon. Ringo would have got the call apparently, but he was busy filming in Spain at the time. Jim Gordon had played with George Harrison on the All Things Must Pass album, which was recorded the previous summer, and Alan White had been with John on Instant Karma the previous year. George Harrison was on main electric guitar duties, and Klaus Voormann, their friend since the Hamburg days, was on bass. On keys they had Nicky Hopkins, who had turned professional at 16. As a session keyboard player, he had contributed to many hits by British groups including The Kinks, The Move, The Rolling Stones and The Who. He also played the electric piano solo on the Beatles' Revolution. The band did start to record as soon as they assembled, but it wasn't until Phil Spector arrived that the recordings got started in earnest. Veal said Phil was very forthright. He quickly assembled in his mind a picture of what he wanted to achieve, and was very much on the top of everything that went on. He was used to working in big professional studios, not one that was in the middle of being built, so he had expected everything to be there ready to go. I very much liked his production ideas and his approach. I thought from his influence and the control of the musical work, he was right at the top of his profession. John had always been a fan of artificial double tracking, a process used in a second tape machine with a variable speed control to double apart, usually a vocal, without having to record it again. Although for Veal, this was easier said than done, he said. I had no experience of ADT, so I didn't have a clue how to get it right. In the end, I drove to Abbey Road with Lennon, Spector and a trail of engineers to create it there. As soon as I heard what they were after, I realised what the problem was. The playback was reverse phase, so what was coming back was out of phase. It took me about 5 minutes to correct it, then we had our own ADT effect at Ascot. The classic Lennon slapback delay was achieved using a second tape machine that they were using to create the ADT effect, most likely a Studer B62. The timing of this would have been varied in relation to the tempo of the track, but around 150 milliseconds would be a good starting point if you wanted to achieve a similar result.
In the middle of the night, in the middle of the night.
For the reverb, the studio was equipped with an EMT 140 plate and a dedicated chamber. Phil Spector was known for his love of long reverbs, but Ted Turner, who played acoustic guitar on Crippled Inside, recalls, "When we were listening to the tracks, I remember Phil turning up the reverb and John immediately turning it down. I interpreted this as John's confidence that he was going to have it done his way, even when working with a mastermind producer." This delay, coupled with the reverb, can be heard all over different instruments on this album, including the drums. Here are some isolated drums where the effect features prominently. Veal recalls having Uri limiters in the studio, and these were most likely to be 1176 LNs. Interestingly though, there appears to be very little else on the outboard equipment list, so it's quite basic. For the instruments, Ascot was equipped with a Steinway grand piano, the famous white one from the Imagine video. This piano is widely associated with John and the song Imagine, due to its inclusion in the video and the album promotional material, though it wasn't actually used on the recording. On the 27th of May, John started tracking Imagine on this piano, but it was quickly determined that the acoustics of the White Room were not ideal. John tried it out, but there was just too much room content, the room was too reverberant, and it wasn't a complementary reverberation to the piano. The recording continued with John playing his Steinway upright piano, on which he wrote the song one morning earlier on in the year.
Imagine all the people sharing.
George can be seen here playing John's Sonic Blue Stratocaster that he and John had both purchased one each of in 1965, although it appears he later changed the neck, as the original had rosewood. He also played his own Gibson Les Paul named Lucy that was given to him by Eric Clapton. The main amps he used appear to be the Fender Vibrachamp and the Fender Bassman seen here. John favoured his Epiphone Casino through a Fender Bassman when he wasn't on piano. Interestingly, the Casino was still his electric guitar of choice on Imagine, even though it was apparently difficult to play by that point. Between takes of How Do You Sleep, John can be heard exclaiming, "This guitar is just crippling beyond belief, I can't play it." Apparently John didn't take care of his guitars, and would just play them regardless of what state they were in. Klaus was using his 62 Fender Precision into an Ampeg B15N. Classic flat wound strings with a bridge mute was employed for a warm, defined sound. He also played upright bass on Crippled Inside. Vorman remembers, "John said he wanted an upright bass. I'd never played one before, but he said, 'Nah, you can play it.' So John sent me to London with Mal Evans, and we rockers went into a classical music store full of neat people wearing bow ties. Mal bought a really good, huge, full-size upright bass. John wanted it played like a slap bass, and I couldn't do it. So I played the notes on the bass with my left hand, and Alan White played the strings like drums with his sticks." There were a few acoustic guitars at Ascot, Lennon's 62 Martin D28, a couple of Gibsons and some Yamahas. There was also a 12-string Hagstrom that seemed to have been used a few times, most notably on Oh Yoko and Crippled Inside. A white pump organ was played by John Barnum on the song Jealous Guy, and can briefly be seen in the John and Yoko Above Us Only Sky documentary. The Beatles were fond of these late 19th century organs, and John was obviously still fond of them too, making sure he had one on hand at Ascot. Nick Hopkins brought along his own Wurlitzer to the session, and he can be seen here playing it on How Do You Sleep. The drums at Ascot were the Ludwig Silver Sparkle with a supraphonic snare. From examining the video footage, it looks like a 3-mic setup with one Neumann U87 overhead, a U87 near the snare. The kick drum mic was most likely the Neumann U47, with another U47 used for the bass amp. For the piano, a pair of Neumann KM184Is were used, and it looks like they were also used for the guitar amps. For vocals, the U87 was also used for the most part. A few of these mics have since resurfaced, and bizarrely on Craigslist a few years ago. After only 5 days of recording, these main tracks then went off to the record plant in New York for overdubs, with strings from the Flux Fiddlers, who are members of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and King Curtis adding saxophone to It's So Hard and I Don't Want to Be a Soldier Mama. It's highly likely that the piano for Imagine was overdubbed here as well at this time, as record plant assistant engineer Jack Douglas recalls this happening. The Imagine piano bought by George Michael was the piano he wrote the song on though, and there's no dispute there. This was bought for $1.45 million and is now on display at the Strawberry Fields exhibition in Liverpool. The finished album featured 11 songs and was well received by the music press and public. The song Imagine, of course, went on to be hailed as one of the greatest songs ever written. Not bad for a couple of weeks' work.
It probably took no know more than